This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
Well, I guess in digressing from anything pertaining to today's show, the Firefly Funhouse is back. So there's your SmackDown report for the week, everybody. We can all go home. Seriously. Of all the things for them to dig up from the realm of bad ideas, they went with the Firefly Funhouse skits. I'm relieved I didn't watch. I was already about to put myself out of my misery with watching Uncle Howdy darken my television screen every week. But upon hearing that the puppets are back in full effect, guess it's only a matter of time before the Fiend rises from the ashes. Which is why I'm dreading everything about that ridiculous pitch black match they're advertising for next weekend. Because it's going to suck. We all know it's going to suck. It's just a question of how painful is the viewing experience going to be. I guess we'll find out next weekend when they find my body washed up on the beaches of Normandy. But we're not here to talk about SmackDown this week. We are here to talk about the 1994 Royal Rumble and the follow-up episode of Retro Raw, which we will get into a little bit later on. But I've been looking forward to adding this to our Retro Review Series. So far, we've done the 1993 SummerSlam and the 1993 Survivor Series shows, on top of the Retro Raws, of course. It's been fun, if for anything, going back and reliving some of my childhood memories for the first time in a while. Even if the shows weren't always great, there's still a bit of nostalgia that hangs over from all that time of not seeing the shows in full. I mean, as much as I constantly complain about the service, it is the one benefit of the Peacock network. Because I don't own the VHS tapes to a lot of these pay-per-views anymore. I never had a lot to begin with. Tape collecting just wasn't a thing that I was smart enough to take advantage of as a kid. So my tape library is kind of a jumbled mess of random things. A lot of recordings of the old Raw and SmackDown shows, some of the Nitros too. But yeah, the pay-per-views, not so much. And admittedly so, I've sort of needed a palate cleanser for a while, frankly. The last week or so has been hard for a lot of wrestling fans. The passing of Jay Briscoe hit us pretty hard, and we're still in kind of a mourning period over that right now. So I needed a little bit of a picker-upper to get me back on my feet and try to get me in a moderately decent mood. I have no idea how I was expecting the 1994 Royal Rumble to do that, but yeah, there was still some good stuff on here. So without further ado, considering this is already going to be a lengthy show anyway, why don't we go ahead and dive into this one. If you're checking us out for the first time here on the FSWR channel, make sure to subscribe, comment, like the podcast, and always come back to check out our new content on Mondays and Fridays. We are here on YouTube and Rumble, so whichever platform satisfies you, you can watch on your own volition. All right. So the 1994 Royal Rumble, aka Season 7, Episode 1. Because Peacock. Because that's what you get when you put non-wrestling personnel in charge of overseeing and operating a streaming platform. Everything must be broken down into season. Meanwhile, the wrestling fans that are searching for content like me are having to guess the season instead of just doing something obvious like, titling the pay-per-views by year, like wrestling has done for years and years. Common sense stuff. Getting past that, though, yes, I promised we were going to review this thing. It's been, to borrow an old cliche, a hot minute since I've gone back and seen this pay-per-view in full. At the time this pay-per-view first aired back in '94, I would have been 7 years old at the time. I remember seeing it live with my brothers. I remember being in our old living room at my home in Pittsburgh before we did the renovation on our house. So you got myself, 2 older brothers, and my dad crammed into this box living room with 1 TV, a 2-cushion couch, and a computer off to the side. So suffice it to say, we were pretty snug and cozy watching this for 3 straight hours. Not to mention having to watch it on one of those old-fashioned Quasar TV monitors, or Quasar, I don't even remember how you pronounce the company. Good old days. Back when they had the built-in VCRs. And unfortunately, this was one of the pay-per-views we actually ordered from our cable provider back in the day that we did not wind up making a tape of. Illegally. So I do not have this as part of my collection of pirated VHS tapes. I know I'm probably speaking lingo right now to all the kids out there. Some of you watching right now probably have no idea what a frickin' VHS is, much less TV sets that had built-in VCRs attached to them. Y'all probably look at me like I have steaming turds hanging out of my mouth right now. But here I am at the ripe age of, well, you do the math. I stopped counting how old I was after 21. They all just kind of blend together after a while. But I'm sitting here watching this pay-per-view for the first time in Lord knows how long, watching it through a streaming service on an iPhone. Ain't technology something else? And considering how long it's been since I've actually seen this in full again, this was definitely a trip down memory lane if there ever was one. The show took place on January 22nd, 1994, at the Providence Civic Center in Rhode Island. I have absolutely no idea why they decided to host the 1994 Royal Rumble from Providence, Rhode Island, of all places. It was still the northeastern territory of the country, and the WWF had a well-established base in that region. New York, Baltimore, D.C. It was close enough to their home turf to where they weren't crossing too close into WCW grounds. Because, this was still around the period in WWF's history where they still weren't drawing particularly well in a lot of the southern areas of the country. Places like Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas. Those are like no-go regions for the WWF to try and do business around this point. The cultural difference in the wrestling fan bases were still too polarizing at the time, so they stayed in their neck of the woods. And while I normally don't spend a whole lot of time going into house numbers or gates because, quite frankly, that's something you can probably just research on your own time, it never really interested me all that much. I know people like to hear the statistics and numbers about these shows, but I'm more so just interested in running down the card because that's all I really care about. But in case you're wondering, the show did about 14,500 in attendance. The buy rate was estimated around 200,000, which for this period in the WWF was probably what you would consider average. Again, we talked about this a while ago, but business was not doing particularly well around this point. It was still relatively a down period for the company as a whole, and it really would only get progressively worse over the next few years, right up until about late 97 or early 98 when business would start to pick up again. It wasn't a disastrous number by any means, but not particularly good. But I'll say this out of the gate. The one thing I miss about the classic WWF pay-per-views, not going 3+ goddamn hours. My God, you want to talk about things I took for granted as a kid. Pay-per-view length. I miss the good old days when pay-per-view operated under the get in and GTFO mantra. Here's your 3-hour window allotted to your running pay-per-view. If you go over, fuck you, basically. Nowadays with streaming, it's so easy to just buy more airtime when you're running these special events. And before you know it, you're looking at the clock and a pay-per-view that started at 8 p.m. Eastern is closing in on fucking midnight. WWE and AEW, they both have that problem today. I liked it back in the day when pay-per-view actually ran a reasonable length of time. That way, if it sucked, at least I could say, well, I only wasted 3 hours of my life instead of 6. Anyhow, the show began with Vince McMahon running down the card for the evening. And who should wind up joining him as guest color man for the event but Ted DiBiase. Haven't seen the $1 Million Man in a long-ass time. Last thing he was involved with on television before leaving was the SummerSlam match he had with Razor Ramon last year. Since that point, I believe he had a brief stint over in Japan. That only lasted a short while before he essentially had to retire due to all the injuries he sustained over the course of his career. I think it ended up being neck problems that forced the early retirement for him. But he was back for the show, and this ended up sort of being his reintroduction back into the WWF as a manager before they ended up kickstarting the $1 Million Corporation stuff later in the year. Then, of course, by 97, he's showing up on Nitro as a member of the fucking NWO. And while normally the color position would have been reserved for Bobby the Brain Heenan, again, if you've been following along in our Raw retro reviews, Heenan had already left the WWF by this point, and again, I believe he was already with WCW by January of this year, which accounted for why they needed to bring in a guest guy to do color. Otherwise, poor Vince would have been out there having to call it by himself. And for all our sanity, it would have been a horrid idea. So the opener for the event was Tatanka versus Bam Bam Bigelow. As noted by Vince during the ring intros, these two had a lot of history with one another prior to them booking this match. So much so, in fact, that I had completely forgotten that this match ever existed or took place. And as it turns out, for those that like historical context, the reason this match is probably so unmemorable basically boils down to the fact that, well, this was never the originally scheduled match for the card. As we've been seeing with the Retro Raw reviews, Tatanka had been in an ongoing feud with Ludwig Borga, and that had been kind of fuming since the match they had on Superstars, where Borga ended Tatanka's undefeated streak. Since that point, Borga had also been doing an on and off program with Lex Luger that never really went anywhere. Even though I could have sworn that they had at least one match together before they scrapped Ludwig Borga altogether, turns out apparently they never even did one match, which probably was a good idea in theory. Meanwhile, on the other side of the coin, Bam Bam had been doing the thing with Luna Vachon on TV. They were doing some rather unfunny comedy sketches with him and Doink that, again, never really went anywhere, to my recollection. And in one of the more recent things we had seen from Bam Bam on TV, he was wrestling Bastion Booger, which is a travesty the likes of which you've never seen. So in other words, how this match came together, your guess is as good as mine. It was very much a last-minute card filler. I believe the initial plan was to do Borga versus Tatanka, probably with Tatanka getting his win back over Borga. But again, they finally caught on around this point that Borga just wasn't working as a gimmick, so they kind of just bowed out with a graceful exit and didn't really acknowledge it all that much after the fact. Now, while this evidently made for a better quality pay-per-view match, there wasn't a whole lot of inbuilt story, but it was a very grassroots, elementary-style WWF prelim opener. That was just word salad for saying it was a good match. Didn't go a long time, which it didn't need to. You know, Tatanka got to shine early on. Bam Bam was able to cut him off for a while and work him over for the heat. There was a rather comedic moment here where Tatanka was teasing the comeback when he was doing the war dance no-sell, and then Bam Bam just gave him an insecurity to the back of the head and cut him off again. I wrote down, the one time somebody figured out how to thwart Tatanka's comeback, kick the guy in the back of the head as hard as you can. Novel concept. If only they figured out how to do that to Hulk Hogan. Probably would have saved us a lot of torture and punishment. But the big spot at the end was Bam Bam going up for the missed moonsault, and then Tatanka ended up giving him a diving crossbody off the top for the clean pin. Crowd pop for the finish. Again, didn't overstay its welcome. I had no problem with it. Again, I much would rather take a last-minute Bam Bam Tatanka match over him and Ludwig Borga. As I notated here, though, it's just a shame that the win never really did squat for Tatanka, because they still wound up burying him 10 feet under. But coming out of that, we went over to a VTR to highlight the Bret Owen Hart story, which has basically been brewing, dating all the way back to the SummerSlam 93 incident, where Owen had bumped Bret off the apron during their Survivor Series tag match, and when Owen knocked Bret into the guardrail, Shawn Michaels took advantage and rolled up Owen to pin him. The one Hart brother in that match that was not one of the remaining survivalists, which you knew was going to stick in Owen's craw all those months later. And since that time, they had been towing that line with Owen's character where he was starting to go full-fledged heel on TV, but, you know, instead of diving headfirst into it, they've been sort of backpedaling to get you think that Owen and Bret were actually going to be on the same page again. They had shot the pre-tapes on WWF Superstars where Owen was laying out the challenge to Bret because he wanted to prove that he was the superior brother. It was never anything personal for Owen, but all he wanted to prove that he was not going to live in Bret's shadow anymore. But for Bret, he just couldn't bring himself to cross that family line. And that's why he was not going to accept the challenge. He put his foot down and said, "No, I'm not going there." Which set up this tag match at the Rumble with them facing the Quebecers for the WWF tag titles, because a couple weeks after that familial tension had ensued, Bret and Owen hashed it out as brothers. They got back on the same page, and now they have their goals set on one thing: to become the WWF Tag Team Champions. And because Owen has been secretly plotting the whole time to fuck over Bret, he's still doing the condescending, smarmy promos where he's talking about how 1994 is going to be the year of the Rocket, and how he's going to lead the charge for him and Bret to become the new champions. And Bret's going to follow behind him and watch his back like a pack mule. And how Bret's going to be hitched behind Owen the whole way, carrying his bags. And meanwhile, the entire time Owen is doing this upbeat, peppy promo while simultaneously throwing Bret under the bus like a fucking douchebag, I am laughing my ass off the whole time. Not only because it was so painfully obvious what Owen was doing here, but I'm sitting here the whole time like, how in the fuck did Bret never see any of this coming? He's supposed to be the babyface in this whole thing, and he never saw the fact that Owen was still making this all about him in the end? Isn't that the last thing you want to do in a feud, is make your babyface look like a goddamn idiot? Well, sure enough, Bret was an idiot. I'm telling you, man, if you have never seen the Owen Bret Hart promos in the build-up to WrestleMania 10, you got to find them on YouTube. The subtlety of jealous Owen doing everything to undercut his brother, it's genius-level delivery. He was so great. Can't say enough good things about Owen Hart, man. So that takes us to the match. Owen and Bret wrestling the Quebecers for the WWF tag titles. Belts that the Quebecers had just recently won back a week ago during a, quote, phantom title switch that happened during a dual-hosted WWF program. And if you want further elaboration on that, just go listen to my Retro Raw review from last week where we kind of broke down that whole ongoing story. And before we get into details about everything that happened in this match, can we just take a second to talk about whatever in the hell that shirt was that Johnny Polo was wearing? You ever hear people make the jokes about dad shirts? The shirts that are so ungodly hideous that you're just embarrassed to be in the same room with your dad when he's wearing them in public? This shirt would have made my own father wince. And he had some pretty vile-looking button-up tops now that I think about it. Generally, the layout for this match was pretty formulaic. Owen and Bret were working pretty well as a cohesive unit for the bulk of it. There was a little bit of choppiness and miscommunication with some double team spots early on that didn't really go as planned. They tried a spot at one point where the Hart brothers went to double Irish whip the Quebecers from the opposite corners, and I don't really know what the hell they were trying to do, but somehow it ended up with Bret doing a drop down so Owen could leap over Bret, kind of sort of spearing Jacques. Meanwhile, he tried to cover Jacques in the ropes while Pierre tripped over Bret trying to break the cover up. It was messy. I don't really know what they were going for there. But eventually it got to the point where the heels were able to isolate Bret. And they had the thing going for a while where they were working over Bret illegally behind the ref's back while he was dealing with Owen. Looking back in context, you can start to wonder if that was intentional on Owen's part. It was during this heat portion of the match where I could have sworn I heard either Vince or DiBiase audibly fart at the commentary desk. It was loud enough to get picked up by the main feed, so if it wasn't a fart, it also could have been one of them just adjusting their seats, but either way, it was noteworthy. But they ended up building to the first babyface hot tag, where Owen was able to come in and fire off on the Quebecers with some stuff. He ended up going for a sharpshooter on Jacques, but while the ref was busy trying to get Bret back on the apron, Pierre ran in from behind and gave Owen the bulldog. So within about a minute of Owen getting to make the initial comeback, the heels immediately cut him back off and took control again. And eventually Owen was able to tag Bret back in so he could sort of bail him out. Keep in mind, while the constant tags for the Hart'S are happening here, Pierre and Jacques are just kind of both in the ring at the same time. Ref's just standing there playing with his dick most of the time. Doesn't bother to boot one of the heels out of the ring. He just lets them in there at the same time while Bret's working them both over. And that kind of leads to the next big spot in the match, where Owen tried to grab Jacques and restrain him so Bret could knock him off the ring apron with a clothesline. But as soon as Bret goes to hit the ropes from the other end of the ring, Polo reaches up and pulls down the second rope, so Bret goes tumbling out to the floor, where he immediately began favoring his knee, and this became an ongoing theme throughout the rest of the program, actually. Once again, Owen playing this off like he did not see it coming. And from there, the heels spent a while picking apart Bret's bad knee on the floor. And the whole time this 2-on-1 beatdown's going on, Owen's in the ring distracting the ref, basically doing everything to draw his attention away from the heels so they can basically rip legs out from under his leg. I know, I'm spoiling the afterbirth. Again, once you kind of figure out where all this is leading in story and you look at the way they structured the interaction between Bret and Owen in this match, it's so fucking hysterical. Owen did everything he possibly could to make sure that when Bret was in jeopardy, he gave the heels ample opportunity to further injure him. Again, without being too blatant about exposing it, but you know what Owen was doing. In the meantime, Ted DiBiase is also running Bret up the flagpole the whole time for him trying to hog the spotlight in the match, while Owen is standing on the apron twiddling his thumbs. Can't forget to mention how great DiBiase was on commentary. But finally, we get to the finishing angle they did. And I remember this finish in particular for being incredibly stupid at the time, mostly because of how abrupt and out of nowhere it all was. But they end up doing the referee stoppage where the official decides that Bret is too injured to continue. So when he goes to put Jacques in the sharpshooter and immediately lets go of the hold because he can't support the weight on his knees, they end the match and they award it to the heels. And of course, Owen's fucking fuming over the BS call and trying to argue with the official. All the while, Bret is laying in the middle of the ring clutching his knee, probably selling the fact that his leg is absolutely ripped to shreds. But Owen is more so pissed about the ref stopping the match before he got the chance to come in and make the heroic save. That's what Owen's pissed about. And then we get the classic post-match angle. The single best moment of Owen Hart's career, bar none. His own brother, hobbling around on one leg, barely mobile. The guy's leg is utterly destroyed. And meanwhile, Owen's standing there, berating him, raking him over the coals the entire time. I was right there on the apron. All you had to do was tag me. And Bret finally musters up the ability to stumble up to one leg. And right as soon as he turns to Owen, Owen reaches around and does the unthinkable. He kicks Bret's leg out from under his leg. And while Bret's on the mat selling and grabbing onto his leg, Owen's walking up the aisleway going, all he had to do was tag me, but he was too selfish. Trying to work the whole match by himself because it's all about Bret. And to top it all off, what made the whole thing absolutely perfect, Ted DiBiase, with the icing on the cake to the segment, where after Owen's venting about how Bret is hogging the spotlight and making it all about him, casually he just goes, under his breath, oh, he's right. This moment right here, this made the entire show worth going back and watching again. I remember this angle like it was yesterday. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've gone back and relived this Owen heel turn. So many times over the years. It is absolutely riotous. And while at the same time, it's supposed to be one of the most dastardly things we'd ever seen. Like, this is why this is so legendary, because it's supposed to be a serious angle. But I just can't help laugh every time I go back and watch it again. To this fucking day, I still get a kick out of it. Literally and figuratively. And while Vince McMahon is selling how disappointed he is, pal, how much of a disgrace this whole situation is, there's Ted DiBiase on commentary doing the patented $1 Million Man laugh. And speaking of legendary moments, the one I've been waiting months to recount, Owen Hart's single best promo of his entire career.
Gotta tell you, I cannot believe what I just saw, Owen. Please tell me why. Why this despicable act?
Why what?
I don't understand.
You wanna know why? Bret Hart, you're nothing but a selfish person. I went in there in a tag team match for the biggest match of my life. It was a dream come true. I thought I had the best partner in the world. my own brother, but you're too selfish, like I've said all along. Your ego is too big. You only worry about yourself, Brett.
Bro,
you don't care about me.
Unbelievable in front of your entire family.
I don't
family
care about anybody. I was concerned about myself and my whole family. The biggest opportunity in my life. I had a chance, Brett, and you stripped it away from me. You took it away from me, Brett, because you're too selfish. All you had to do was just tag me. My hand was there. Just tag me. I knew your leg was bad. I was aware of that. Just tag me. But you're too selfish. You just want to put your sharpshooter on. I could have won the match. I don't need you with a bad leg doing it, Brett. You're too damn selfish. And that's why you're sitting there with a bad leg. And that's why I kicked your leg out of your leg.
Owen, let me ask you something. You've obviously cost Brett a shot at the championship. There's no way he's going to be able to compete in the Royal Rumble match coming up tonight.
Five stars. 6.5 if they did it in the Tokyo Dome. Best thing on the entire show, hands down. All-time classic wrestling moment. Botch or no botch on the promo. Owen fucking up his line made the whole thing a million times better. But even the execution of everything they did here, beautifully done. Perfecto. Tell you what was not beautifully done. IRS versus Razor Ramon for the Intercontinental Championship. And as great as it was hearing them transition over to Jim Ross and Gorilla Monsoon to call this one, the match was an absolute nothing burger. And if you'll recall, the setup to this match was done during an off-camera angle where IRS had allegedly stolen Razor's gold chain, which he had then concealed inside of his signature briefcase. And if you're wondering why we never really addressed much of that on the Retro Raw episodes, that's not intentional. It's just the fact that they rarely ever addressed it. Kind of talked about how the opening match was basically a placeholder match for the card. This was pretty much the epitome of filler programming. I mean, they had already been teasing the feud with Razor and Shawn on television. Shawn's been walking around claiming to be the real Intercontinental Champion, even though Razor had won the belt after Shawn was stripped of it late last year. So, I mean, we all kind of know that's the selling point headed into Mania. IRS was just, again, placeholder opponent for Razor to go over before the big ladder showdown in a couple months. Nothing wrong with that necessarily, but I mean, that's just kind of the reality of the situation. I'd also like to point out for the record, for the most part, the match was all about Razor trying to get his gold chains back from IRS's briefcase. That was at least one of the inbuilt stories. The briefcase was literally just hanging out in the corner of the ring the entire time. So at any point Razor was in control of the match, he could have just walked over, opened the briefcase, took the chains back. It really would not have been all that difficult. And in fact, he had the perfect opportunity to do it at the point they did the rev bump, so Razor could clock IRS with the briefcase. Once again, instead of just opening it, he just tossed it aside. So while the ref is playing dead, Razor's trying to revive him. He ends up hitting IRS with a belly-to-back suplex off the middle rope. And right when he goes to set up IRS for the Razor's Edge, Shawn Michaels runs in the back door and clocks Razor in the back with the Bogus Intercontinental belt, as quoted by Jim Ross. One of the rare times we heard a fake championship be referred to as a bogus title. Reminds me of when WCW had the bogus Sting in the NWO, and they always just called him the bogus Sting on television. What was his name? I always forget. Is it Matt Farmer or Jeff Farmer? Yeah, it doesn't matter. So anyway, all three bodies are laid out in the ring at this point, and when IRS begins to regain consciousness, He begins making the crawl over to cover Razor. At the same time, the original ref began stirring. So he manages to cover Razor's prone body. He lays one arm over him. The ref goes 1. The ref goes 2. And the ref goes 3. And at the point, everyone is thinking that IRS was about to steal the Intercontinental belt from Razor here after this grave miscarriage of justice, while IRS is celebrating in the ring. Who should come out to screw things up but Earl Hebner? So he goes over to tell the initial ref what happened. Well, at first, it started to look like they were teasing restarting the match over, which wouldn't have been a newfound concept in wrestling at this point because, they've done match restarts whenever fucked finishes go down. But you see, the idea behind restarting a match is that A, you're supposed to have the ring announcer signify that the match is being restarted, and B, there should at least be a bell. But we didn't get that. Instead, here's what they come up with. The officials are chatting in the corner, arguing over the two belts. IRS is still celebrating on the turnbuckle. And while that's going on, Razor just gets back up, grabs IRS from out of the corner, gives him the Razor's edge, and pins him. There was no bell to signal the restart of the match. There was no announcement of anything at all. They basically just did two back-to-back finishes. And after it was over, Razor held up both belts, and that was apparently the actual finish. So, what? The story is IRS was posing with the wrong belt, therefore the finish was null and void, and they could just continue the match because Earl Hebner had possession of the real IC title? How would he have told the difference? Aren't they the exact same belt? By the way, here's another question. Why did Shawn leave the belt in the ring after he hit Razor in the back with it? Yeah, to this day, I still really didn't understand that finish, but like I said, even with the swerve at the end, as convoluted and illogical as it probably was, no one thought for a second that IRS was walking out with a belt here. And for those of you wondering, well, did Razor at least get his gold chain back at the end of it? The answer was, I have no idea. Because we never found out. After that, we immediately segued into the vignettes for the upcoming casket match, and I presume Razor may have collected his belongings off camera. Or maybe he just decided fuck it and moved on. Who knows? And speaking of the casket VTRs, I thought we covered them all. As wacky as they've been, I didn't think they could top themselves. But the visual of seeing Paul Bearer outside Taker's workshop in the graveyard, presumably transporting said casket on a carriage all the way to Rhode Island, did they not ever stop to think, U-Haul truck? They went with the classic horse and wagon mode of transportation. Where the fuck was Taker's workshop anyway? Death Valley? Are we to presume that Paul Bearer rode this wagon all the way from Death Valley to Providence, Rhode Island, just to transport this double-braced casket? Specially made for, and I quote, Yokozuna's behemoth carcass. I laughed so hard at that line. But seriously, did they at least use a GPS? Does Google Maps have a filter for a timestamp of how long it would take to travel from Death Valley to Providence via wagon? I didn't think Google Maps included wagon as a method of transportation. I've seen bicycle, car, bus, on foot. No wagon, though. Well, presuming it took approximately 2 days, it's good to know they were able to get the casket to the arena in one piece. Considering the way this match went, though, I think a lot of us would have hoped for a wagon breakdown somewhere along the way. That way it would have prevented us from ever having to see this tragedy. So not to spoil anything, we've already kind of alluded to it on many of the Raw reports. This match was notoriously bad, and I don't think that's something we really need to sugarcoat. Look, y'all know I'm an Undertaker mark. I'm a mark for Mark. What can I say? However, that does not mean that I won't ever sit here along the way and say that Taker was not involved with a lot of bad crap throughout his career. In the year 1994 alone, the guy was involved with a lot of bad shit. Just wait until we get to the Undertaker stuff. So, my God, where the fuck do I even start with this thing? Well, how about Vince's opening line, where he claimed that Yokozuna could wind up turning into, quote, 600 pounds of jellyfish. What? Now, here's the funny thing. The match wasn't half bad for the first part. It's not to say it was particularly good, but it was not hideous. It's no secret that Yokozuna wasn't the most mobile wrestler in the world, but even at this stage in his career, he could still move moderately well for all that weight he was carrying. You know, and Taker was obviously a hell of an athlete himself, so when they were just in there wrestling and doing their signature spots, it wasn't terrible. The problem here is that on top of it being a casket match, it was also no DQ. And they were sure to point this out many times during the course of this match. So obviously, you put two and two together, you know what that means. That meant that everybody that was part of Mr. Fuji's entourage was going to get involved somehow, up to and including dudes that we had never seen on Raw up until the point they actually ran interference in this match. So they get to the spot where Taker is able to get Yokozuna in the casket, and right when he goes to shut the lid, here comes Crush. And he's in there trying to wear down Taker for a minute. He gets fended off. Then here comes the Great Kabuki and Genichiro Tenryu. And I know you're probably thinking to yourself, the Great Kabuki and Genichiro Tenryu, who? Well, yeah. Technically, they were part of Fuji's stable, even though we never saw them on Raw and were probably never alerted to the fact they were friends of Mr. Fuji until this point. But in any case, they both got fended off. Then, here comes Bam Bam Bigelow to run interference. And at this point, the match basically turns into a 5-on-1 handicap match, up to and including Jim Cornette and Mr. Fuji stealing the urn from the floor, not really doing anything constructive with it until Paul Bearer came around and laid them both out. Meanwhile, the heels are all trying to stuff Taker into the casket. Yokozuna is taking a nap inside the casket while all this is going on. And finally, through the mystical powers of the urn, Taker rises from the ashes and starts making a one-man comeback. I wrote down, somewhere in this melee, we also had run-ins from Adam Bomb, Jeff Jarrett, Diesel, and the Head Shrinkers. And it was to the point where this match became such bullshit to where even at the point where Taker was still trying to fire back on the heels, it was so absurd in execution because they basically meant that the other heels had to stand behind him the whole time and then wait for their cue to get punched in the face. Eventually, they all rolled Taker into the casket. I wrote down, the only thing missing at this point is the fucking Marine Corps to come out and help put Taker in this goddamn thing. Still, The Undertaker manages to keep fighting back, all until Yokozuna bumps Bear off the ring apron and steals the urn so that he can hit Taker with it, at which point, green smoke begins to rise from the urn. I'm not making any of this up, people. This is what legitimately happened. I wrote down, this looks to be the color of the vomit that I'm desperately trying to hold down my throat. Vince informs us that the green smoke spilling from the urn indicates that the Undertaker's powers are leaving his body. I retorted with, it's not the only thing that is about to leave my body. And at the point all guys start giving Undertaker dives and splashes from the top rope, they finally roll his dead carcass over to the casket so Yokozuna can push him inside with one foot, and they seal the lid. And I wrote, mercifully, this train wreck is over, although I know the bullshit only proceeds from here. So the heels all attempt to wheel the casket up the aisleway. At this point, they've given Taker plenty of time to escape through the trap door inside the casket, and they get about halfway up the ramp before the lights go out. And this next part, this was a sight to behold. A sight that made Bray Wyatt's Uncle Howdy segments on SmackDown look moderately tolerable by comparison. Well, I've got to talk about it at some point, so I guess we should stop delaying the inevitable. Well, the arena is pitch black at this point. And who should show up on the Titantron but The Undertaker, laying inside the casket with an overhead camera looking down on him. Because, you know, every casket has an inbuilt camera inside the top of the lid so you can see somebody's dead body rotting from the inside out. Happens all the time. And The Undertaker slowly turns to face the camera, and he begins cutting a menacing promo about how the spirit of the soul lives for all of mankind. He mentioned something about an eternal flame that cannot be extinguished, something about how we will all witness the rebirth of The Undertaker very soon, at which point I wrote down, wow, it really is a Bray Wyatt promo, isn't it? And after vowing that he will not rest in peace, he goes into what I presume to be a deep sleep. A deep sleep that would put him on the shelf for a period of time so he could recover from some ongoing injuries he had circulating. But we're not supposed to know that in kayfabe. What we're apparently supposed to know in kayfabe is that The Undertaker's spirit rose from the casket and, I can't believe I'm saying this, ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father, who will come in glory to judge the living and the dead. And for anybody out there that's either Catholic or part of a Christian denomination, you'll at least get that joke. Haven't recited it in ages, but I could probably still do it by heart. And, well, Yeah. That was a long-winded way of getting to the point of the actual story. The nutshell summary is The Undertaker dies in kayfabe, and his spirit rises into heaven while Paul Bearer holds up the urn and ensures us that the spirit of The Undertaker lives on. So his resurrection is forthcoming. Because professional wrestling. So yeah, that fucking blew chunks. I know you're probably sitting there asking yourself, are you sure The Undertaker is still your all-time favorite wrestler? To which I say, the fact that he was able to recover from this ridiculous fucking angle, yeah, I'd say he deserves to be considered an all-time great. Pick whatever word in the thesaurus you want to find for synonyms for atrocious. They're all applicable here. It was probably a negative 5-star match at the time. I'd still take watching this again over a lot of the other bad stuff I've seen in wrestling over the years. But, yeah. Definitely a memorable moment in wrestling for all of the wrong reasons. For everything that made the Bret Owen Hart angle from earlier a great moment in wrestling history, this was pretty much the polar opposite on every level. There's no defending this piece of junk segment. It may at least be forgivable in some aspects if the match itself was not downright abysmal in every sense of the word too, but I can't find one redeeming quality about anything they did here. People remember this for being historically bad. There's a valid reason for that. And if you're one of the people out there that don't remember this, trust me when I tell you, as someone that is the biggest Undertaker fan in the world, my favorite wrestler of all time, and I make no bones about it, trust me, this is fucking repugnant. Foul. Devoid of merit. Avoid at all costs. Even Mark Calloway would tell you to actively avoid watching this. No bueno. And again, if you think Undertaker was fed a bad deal here at the 1994 Royal Rumble, just you wait until he comes back later in the year. We are only scratching the surface of how bad things would get. There's so much more. But why don't we go ahead and cleanse ourselves of that stench? Because now it is time to talk about the 1994 Royal Rumble match. And I literally do mean the Royal Rumble match. Back when they only used to do one of these every year at the Rumble before they started getting all the girls involved and ruining the entire concept of what the Rumble match was supposed to be. If y'all have a problem with me saying that, piss up a rope. Alert me to any point in the last several years that the girls have had a moderately good Royal Rumble match. I've got a boat in Cancun to sell to you. The other thing that should be noted too, back before the Rumble match became all about random surprise returns, I believe headed into the actual pay-per-view event here in 94, we knew who all 30 participants were going to be. Which is funny, because as of this current moment for the 2023 Royal Rumble next weekend, I believe last we heard they had a total of like 8 people announced. So again, going back to how much they've neutered this match over the years, now it's not even about giving us at least a handful of potential names that could possibly win. Now it's just about what legend is going to make a guest appearance in the thing only to get eliminated like 15 seconds later when no one gives a shit afterwards. But looking past all that, I'm going to try and break this Rumble match down into what I would consider notable takeaway moments. I could sit here and ramble off all 30 entries for the next hour and make it the most monotone paint-by-numbers match review in the history of Royal Rumble reviews. But again, I'm not going to sit here for 5 hours and do that, because I don't have the energy to, nor the time. So I'm just going to get to the meatier things that happened, because we talked about this before, but the Rumble matches are traditionally pretty formulaic in terms of their blueprint. Aside from any angles or spots that happen during the match, more often than not, you get about 10 to 15 minutes of noteworthy material, and the rest of the time, it's dudes standing around either doing nothing or sucking wind in the corner. So the first thing I jotted down for this match, oh, looky here, the Steiner brothers are still alive. Last time we saw them heavily involved in anything on WWF television, it was like SummerSlam time last year when they were facing the Heavenly Bodies for the WWF tag titles. Since that point, they dropped the straps to the Quebecers and pretty much disappeared from television. And as we noted around the time they sort of went away, a lot of that had to do with the fact that they were getting into some trouble with the office. I couldn't really document the particulars of what was happening at the time, but it basically killed their push in WWF for the remainder of their contracts. And by early summer of '94, they were both gone from the company and wound up in WCW a couple years later. And the rest is kind of history from there. But Rick and Scott ended up being 2 of the first entries in the match. Scott was number 1, Rick was number 3. And they worked over Samu of the Head Shrinkers during the early part of the match, right before he eliminated himself, essentially. In a spot that was so scary, I had actually thought the guy died on the spot as soon as it happened. They do the old low bridge spot where Samu was supposed to leap over the Steiners and fly over the top rope out to the floor. There was no way he could have timed that again if he tried in a million years. But when he went over the top rope, he ended up trapping his neck in the ropes. Literally looked like he hung himself on the spot. How he didn't die, I will never know. But let it be known for the record, the first elimination of the 1994 Royal Rumble nearly resulted in fatality. Meanwhile, at the same time that's going on, who should come out at number 4 but Kwong? And I know what you're probably thinking to yourself. Who in the fuck is Kwong? Well, if you didn't already know that it was Savio Vega under a mask doing a stereotypical Asian kung fu gimmick, you probably have very little memory of Kwong in the WWF. And much like a lot of bad gimmicks in the company around the mid-90s, this one lasted all of like 2 or 3 months before they scrapped it. And they had him debut a little later on as plain old Savio Vega when he was doing the Alliance stuff with Razor. Anyway, we were about 10 or so minutes into the match when the ring started to fill in with some more guys. And so began one of the more memorable parts of the 1994 Royal Rumble, the rather slow burn tease of Diesel's babyface turn, as he began clearing the ring of everyone and started racking up some eliminations in pretty rapid-fire order. And of course, the people popped for him, clearing the ring of like 4 guys at a time. He threw out Scott, he threw out Bart Gunn, he threw out Owen, which he sold perfectly by throwing a hissy fit on the floor afterwards. He threw out Savio, At the point, Bob Backlund came in and tried to amateur wrestle Nash over the top rope, which was comedic. He threw Backlund out. He immediately dumped Billy Gunn. The fans at this point are cheering for Diesel like he's the biggest babyface in the WWF since Hulk Hogan. It's, it's actually kind of astonishing how quickly all this came together, too. Like, we remember the Diesel babyface turn, but I don't think we remember how quickly it all unfolded. Literally, it was like 2 weeks ago on television where Diesel was still working as Shawn Michaels' flunky bodyguard. He was still getting booed. And then here at the Rumble, they did a complete 180 with him out of nowhere and immediately began building him up as a monster babyface. Just by tossing dudes over the top rope. That's all he had to do. And the people went knucking futs for him. It's amazing. Now, it's also important to note that a little earlier on in the match, right before Diesel came out, in fact, Vince had mentioned that they were trying to get a cameraman in the back because there was apparently some chicanery happening behind the scenes. Turns out that it was Mr. Fuji's entourage beating up Lex Luger in the hallway, and they kind of used this to fill some dead air time while Diesel was in the ring waiting for the next guy to come out. We'll talk about that in a minute. The whole backstage altercation. Meanwhile, Diesel's still in the ring, kicking ass and wrecking shop. Finally, out comes the Macho Man to even the playing field a little bit. What ultimately would wind up being Savage's last Rumble event before he would depart the company at the end of the year. We ended up getting a little WrestleMania preview here between Savage and Crush, which was about as underwhelming as the Macho Man's elimination, which literally had no build-up. Crush just picked him up, and he threw him out. Probably one of the biggest popcorn fart eliminations in the whole match. All the while, Doink is in the ring, doing bad comedy with the likes of Bam Bam, Diesel, and Crush, wherein I noted 3 heels and a babyface clown, and the most unlikable of all the gimmicks is the one I'm supposed to cheer for. By the way, that's not me hating on Matt Bourne, that's me hating on the Doinky gimmick. At the point after Doink was eliminated, I noted there isn't a single person in the ring at this point under 300 pounds. And just when you think it couldn't get any more crowded with bad gimmicks, who should come out but Sparky Plug? Spark Plug Bob Holly. The fake NASCAR driver. Finally made his debut for the WWF. And Vince actually had the gall to tease us with the idea that it could be Spark Plug Bob Holly main eventing WrestleMania 10. To which I immediately noted, the star power in 1994 sucked a massive cock. Still better than today's business, but my God was the star power lacking back in the day. So much so that the people actually started a unanimous Diesel chant after he finally got dumped. The one time in Kevin Nash's career where he was actually moderately over for a cup of coffee. And then Vince tried to put the title on him in about a year, and it all went to shit from there. By now, we were probably about halfway through the actual match. The ring was getting more cluttered with bodies, and most of them were underneath guys. And Shawn Michaels. I made sure to note, whoever in the hell signed off on Bob Holly's ring gear should be quietly taken out in the middle of the night and shot in the back of the head. There was more weight in this match at this point than everybody on AEW's roster combined. Should also be noted, I don't know why I didn't bother bringing this up until now. So for this entire Rumble, they had the countdown clock, but at no point did they ever throw up graphics on the screen for guys coming down during the later entrances. So by the time we got to this point in the match, I had no idea what entry number we were on. Nor did Vince or DiBiase, apparently. Probably would have helped to keep track of those entries. So we're trudging along here. We ended up getting to the moment in the match where Bret was supposed to come out. But seeing as how Owen left him for dead earlier on, he did not come out initially. And all Vince could chalk that up to was, that's a shame. Great sell, Vince. And oddly enough, we waited for a couple more entries to come out. And then finally here comes Bret. Limping and pimping, wobbling and hobbling on one bad knee down to the ring. At which point I said, so who was supposed to enter during the entry where nobody came out from Gorilla? Because it wasn't Lex Luger. Luger came out during his regularly scheduled entrance, despite being laid out by a bunch of heels in minutes prior. None the worse for wear, apparently. So why they shot that angle, I have no idea, because Luger was perfectly fine. But, yeah, so Bret, I guess, didn't come out when he was supposed to, but then he just waited a couple entries later, and then he came out. So I'm not entirely sure what was going on there. Anyway, at this point, I was in dire need of something remotely interesting to occur. There was plenty of humanity in the ring, and not a lot of it was doing much of note. Who should then come out but Marty Jannetty, immediately going after Shawn Michaels and kickstarting their storied history with one another. And the people pop for that. Finally, things come down to the final entry, number 30. And where historically people would usually be waiting with bated breath to see who the last entry wound up being for the Rumble match, sitting on pins and needles awaiting some kind of big surprise. Who was the final man to enter the 1994 Royal Rumble? Adam Bomb. You talk about the epitome of underwhelming final entries for a Royal Rumble match. What was that one year? The time where people wanted Bryan Danielson to be the last entry in the Rumble, and it ended up being someone that nobody wanted to see, and the crowd all booed the shit out of it. Wasn't it like Rey Mysterio or someone big too? Well, the people didn't rage boo Adam Bomb when he came out, but it was flatter than 4 o'clock. But, well, the ring started to clear out a little bit at this point. At this stage, if you were at least moderately smart to the business, you could take a look at the remaining participants and basically boil it down to like 3 probable winners. You had Lex, you had Bret, and you had Shawn. Everyone else was just kind of placeholder until it came down to the final 3 or 4 guys. And for our final 4, how's this for a case of one of these guys is not like the others? You had Luger, you had Bret, you had Shawn, and you had Fatu. Fatu, the soon-to-be Sultan in a few years. And even a little later after that when he became Rikishi during the Attitude Era. Where he actually got over as a main eventer for a brief period. Hard to remember that was a thing at one point. He did it for The Rock. Remember that. Anyway. So they wind up doing this awesome double elimination spot with Fatu and Shawn, where Bret and Luger do the double Irish whip from opposite corners. And while Fatu's charging at Bret, Bret drops down so that Fatu goes flying out to the floor. And Luger at the same time ends up elevating Shawn overhead, sending him sailing into the air over the corner post. Probably one of the best bumps I've seen Shawn take in his entire career. And I believe at this point, We all kind of have vague memories of how the actual finish of the match went. One of the more famous Royal Rumble moments in history, where both Bret and Luger wind up going over the top rope at the same time, where both men's feet hit the floor simultaneously. And there's all the pandemonium and controversy over who actually touched the ground first. So they go through the series of deals where Howard Finkel initially announces that Luger was the winner, only for Earl Hebner, of all people, to get in Fink's face and inform him that it was Bret who actually won. How's that for a fucking rib? Earl Hebner coming to the defense of Bret Hart in 1994. 3 years before he fucked him over in Montreal. So that's what it boils down to. Bret didn't return the favor by thanking Earl. So he screwed him. It all makes sense now. All these years later, we finally have found the reason behind the Montreal screw job. It was all Bret's fault. He really did screw Bret. I'm just kidding. But looking past that, this is a pretty unique moment in Rumble history. They did this exact finish, I believe, only one other time in history, where they had basically two co-Rumble winners. Didn't they do this exact same thing with like Cena and Lesnar in the mid-2000s? Or am I thinking one of the other OVW guys? It's been so long, you gotta forgive me. Maybe it was Batista I was thinking of. All I remember is that they did this finish again at some point, and it was notoriously hysterical because that was the same pay-per-view where Vince came barreling down the aisleway, and as soon as he tried to slide into the ring under the ropes, he immediately blew out both of his quads. It's the funniest fucking visual in the world, because Vince is sitting there with his legs extended outwards, like totally unable to move while you got the referees and the wrestlers trying to get clarity on what the hell is going on. And there's Vince sitting there completely immobile in the goddamn ground. Oh my God. But, sadly, I don't think we're ever going to make it to that point in our FSWR experience where we can talk about the time Vince blew out both of his fucking quads on live pay-per-view. But, getting back on track here, this was... I'll say this. It was an interesting concept for the time. They never did this before. And, you know, while they milked the hell out of the actual announcement for almost 5 straight minutes, they did a pretty good job with the actual execution of the double elimination spot. You know, and they were smart enough to conceal the camera as much as possible in the case that the timing was a little bit off, but with the shot they got, it basically looked like Luger and Bret hit at the exact same time. I'm sure there have been experts that broke down the frame-by-frame footage with hidden cameras and fucking pie charts to demonstrate that Luger hit the floor approximately 0.0008324 seconds before Bret did. But, I mean, we're not going to go into a sports analysis of anything here. Obviously, we know what this is setting up for Mania, and I don't want to go too in-depth with that now. You know, we're doing the Retro Raw review, so we'll have plenty of time to break down how they actually got from here to WrestleMania and how they went about structuring this whole program. But, I mean, I remember watching this as a kid and kind of being confused by it. This was probably only my second or third Rumble match I had seen before I went back in my later teens and actually rewatched a lot of the ones from like 88, 89, 90, even 91. Those Rumble events I hadn't actually seen until I was probably in my mid-teens and had access to the VHS tapes. A couple of which I think I rented out from Blockbuster. Remember when that was a thing back in the day? And by me renting it out, I mean my parents, because I wasn't actually the one doing the renting. But, yeah, I don't remember too much of what my brothers thought of it at the time. They were older than me, so they were a little smarter than I was, obviously. My dad didn't give a fuck because he was just a casual watcher back then anyway. He mostly just ordered the pay-per-views for us. He didn't really know a whole lot was going on half the time. But even as a kid, I just remember thinking, I don't know. I don't want to say I was unsatisfied with what they did, just kind of confused and perplexed about the whole thing. And, I mean, to be fair, I guess that was supposed to be the main takeaway from it. That way we would tune into Raw in a couple days to see what the follow-up would be. It is kind of interesting, though, how aside from that one year in the mid-2000s, they never did a finish like this ever again. You know, I wonder sometimes, just to maybe change things up a little bit and give us something different. You know, we talk about how bland and overexposed the Rumble concept is anymore. Maybe doing a finish like this again wouldn't be such a bad idea. I mean, you've got a good excuse to do it now because they're running WrestleMania for 2 nights every year. So why not do like co-Rumble winners one year where one guy faces the champion on night 1, the other on night 2. If it happens that the champion drops the strap on the first night, you just have the 2 Rumble winners wrestle on night 2 for the actual title. At least that would kind of shake things up a bit. I mean, I was just spitballing that off the top of my head, but, you know, even going back and watching this again in 2023, I certainly didn't hate the finish. The Luger experiment was already kind of dead in the water by this point, so, I mean, you can even hear it going back and watching the show again. The people were more on Bret's side than they were Luger's. But, you know, even before Vince kind of scrapped his plans with the whole Lex Express gimmick, he was still looking to factor him into WrestleMania for that big match. You know, even if he wasn't going to wind up putting the belt on him, at least by this point, he was still on board with Luger up to then. It's funny how we talk about how quickly Vince is to change plans later on, especially when he started getting more impatient and senile. But going back in the time machine, even here in 94, he kept to his game plan. And there's something to be said about that. So, be interesting to hear you all chime in if you ever got the chance to see this show or if you have any memories of it. All in all, when I look back at it with modern eyes, it really is kind of an all-over-the-map pay-per-view. The opener was fine for what it was. The WWF tag title match and the Owen heel turn was the best thing on the show, hands down. One of my all-time favorite wrestling moments. The IC title match existed, although it wasn't terrible. The casket match was all-time horrible in every sense of the word, up to and including the afterbirth. And the Rumble match itself was boring for the most part with a moderately surprising and halfway decent finish. So, grading everything on a scale is kind of hard. I'd say it wasn't the worst Royal Rumble I would ever see in my lifetime. Would I say it was great or even moderately good? Maybe not. I'd say it was like surface level passable. Probably the time worth however much we spent to order it. I mean, I don't even know what that price range would have been once you factor in inflation with everything. Would I recommend it to be one of the Rumble events that you go back and watch in your free time? Especially from start to finish? Probably not. I'd say in the scope of everything, if you were going to go back and watch anything on the card, watch the Bret Owen versus the Quebecers tag match and shut the show off after the Owen promo. Unless you want to see all-time horrific hocus-pocus BS with The Undertaker rising up from a casket and watching half the fucking roster lay waste to him in the middle of a scheduled title match, in that case, you'll probably have a heart attack by the time the show's over. Which brings us over to the Retro Raw show, January 24th, 1994. And while it did not give me a heart attack, there were a couple things that drove me up a wall here. Out of the gate, though, I will say this. This is probably going to be one of the most rapid-fire reviews we've ever done of Retro Raw, because as you will see very quickly, the show did not have a whole lot to it. Plenty of squashes, not a lot of substance. So the show began with one of the co-winners of the 1994 Royal Rumble. Lex Luger wrestled a man that I could have sworn was the Nature Boy Buddy Landel for the first 3 minutes. He had the exact same build, hair, and gear as something a Buddy Landel would have worn. The only difference was that Landel had a much better physique. But factoring in that this was 1994, I think Landel was still in Smoky Mountain working for Cornette at the time. I believe they said his name was Austin Steele. And it was just a quick squash for Luger. Really nothing else to say about it. After which we immediately went over to the announce desk with Vince McMahon and Jim Ross, where as they ran down the card for the show, JR, I believe, provided his first signature delivery of the term slobberknocker when describing Men on a Mission versus the Head Shrinkers. And if that match was JR's version of a slobberknocker, that match is probably equivalent to my version of a horror show. We'll get to it. It was not that terrible. But they pitched things over to Todd Pettingill so he could do a 30-second recap of the Royal Rumble match from 2 nights prior, wherein he actively tried to describe it as one of the most grueling, intense, exhausting, and entertaining Rumble matches of all time. And I can assure you right here, right now, as someone that literally just got done watching that match less than 48 hours ago, the 1994 Royal Rumble match was none of those appointed adjectives. He also had the balls to try and encourage people to order the pay-per-view replay on the sole basis of seeing the casket match between Taker and Yokozuna. Of all matches on the card to provide as the selling point, he chose the casket match. Insulting. So, barreling right along here with the series of unmemorable squashes. Up next was Jeff Jarrett. He wrestled recurring jobber John Paul, apparently longtime fan of the Beatles. At least 2 of them. And I believe it was during this match where Vince hinted at the idea that Double J was already making his rounds in the Tennessee territory as being the future of the country music scene. Now getting on front pages of magazines. Because as we know from all the vignettes, Jarrett was on a mission to use the WWF as a stepping stone to advance his singing career. Because that was the exact kind of gimmick befitting of a WWF superstar circa 1994. I'm sure Jerry Jarrett was proud. Here is all I wrote down. Jarrett wins with the roll-up after grabbing tights. Worst ring gear I've seen Double J wear up to this point. I said we were only going to briefly touch on the BS. There really wasn't a whole lot to say about most of the stuff that happened on this Raw episode. Then came time for the Slobberknocker, which was originally slated to be the Head Shrinkers versus the Hart Brothers, presumably for the WWF tag titles, was then swapped out for the Head Shrinkers versus, of all teams, Men on a Mission. They said, we needed a suitable replacement team for Owen and Brett. Who do we have on the roster right now that can substitute for those 2 great workers? How about Mabel and Mo? So I know this might come as a shock to all of you. Brace yourselves for what I'm about to say. Men on a Mission was not as good as Owen and or Brett. I know. Sue me. It was during this match where Vince McMahon and JR had fun going back and forth with each other over the term girth, which they used many times to describe Mabel. What they call girth, I say, that's probably being moderately politically correct. Now, to be fair, I presume this match was going to be hideous. Surprisingly, it was adequate. And all joking aside, despite how I may have felt about the gimmick, I cannot deny that the people loved themselves this Men on a Mission group. The whoop there it is chants were over like wildfire, dude. And, they did a moderately decent job here cutting off Mo and getting sympathy on him. Although it should be noted that Vince spent more time here covering how much he rather would have seen Owen and Brett in this match instead. But because of Owen's dastardly attack on Brett at the Rumble, that was clearly out of the equation. One of the funnier things I've seen in a while, actually, Mo finally goes over to tag in Mabel, and at the same time, Samu's trying to charge in Mabel from the other corner, and Mabel's taking about 50 seconds to get in the ring just by stepping over the top rope. So in order to ensure that Mabel gets in the first set of offense to obviously start the comeback, Samu basically has to stop in his tracks to wait for Mabel to get over the top rope and into the ring. So that was rather amusing. But of course, the people pissed themselves when Mabel got in there. He laid waste to all three of the Samoans, and at the point it looked like they were going to go to the finish immediately. Things kind of broke down at the end where guys kept running in to break up pinfall attempts. Ended up with Mabel getting knocked off the apron to the floor so the heels could hit Mo with a big Samoan splash off the top for the pin, which immediately led to Mabel getting in the ring afterwards and hitting Samu and Fatu with double clotheslines, after which they immediately cut to break. There was a lot of abrupt cutting away on this show, by the way. The timing for these segments just kind of felt off. And again, I'll say, while the gimmick never clicked with me personally, these WWF fans love this gimmick for whatever reason. As hokey and cartoony as it was. And I mean, you knew Vince was all about pushing Mabel because of the size alone, as we'd come to find out in the next year or two. Even though I thought this gimmick was death TV from the moment the vignette started airing, somehow, some way, they got people to love it. I'll tell you what, it was certainly more tolerable than Atom Bomb, wherein the only thing I noted about this next squash was the following. When the job guy is a better worker than the guy you're trying to get over, red flag. My God. He wrestled Tommy Angel, who we've also been conveniently seeing as an underneath job guy on the Crockett shows lately. I'll say this. The one good thing Atom Bomb did in this match, he gave Angel a very nice looking top rope clothesline. Other than that, I wrote complete waste of 3 minutes of TV. Lord knows it was any better than this spark plug Bob Holly pre-tape, wherein, after telling us to smell the fuel of the cars on the racetracks, he also assured us that he's super excited to be coming to the WWF. So super excited, in fact, that you could read the expression on his face perfectly. It read, "Fuck me and fuck everything about this gimmick." I don't blame him. So the disaster TV continued. I think progressively the segments actually got worse up until the main event. After this, Doink and Dink did absolute horrendous comedy with a job guy that even JR couldn't muster up the ability to care about. I mean, I have no comment on it. I was checking my email during this thing. Babyface Doink officially has turned the channel heat with me. It sounds incredible too, because heel Doink was like a whole other world. It wasn't ever great to begin with, but at least heel Doink was moderately watchable on television. Babyface Doink is just... no. Everything about it. Despite the fact that Matt Bourne could work. But once you throw in the antics with a midget clown, I just mentally check out. And at this point, after the quick Royal Rumble infomercial, the main event was Shawn Michaels versus Tyrone Knox, which might be one of the most badass ring names for a job guy we've seen on Raw yet. Especially when you got JR going, "You go, Tyrone." How is it that nobody's ever thought to use the name Tyrone as a ring name in the history of wrestling aside from this guy? I mean, I know we had Tyrus at one point in the WWE, but that was probably the closest thing we came to. We need a big, meaty, jacked-up dude to come along into WWE's training center, and they need to call him Tyrone Gigachad. That'd be fucking epic. The super ladies man. The alpha male. Tyrone Gigachad. I'd pay to see that guy. Anyway, Shawn killed him with a pile driver in like 2 minutes. It was the most unmemorable match Shawn's probably had in his entire career. So unmemorable that as soon as he got the pin, Diesel came into the ring, snatched the Bogus Intercontinental belt from the referee, and they immediately cut to commercial. So, yeah, remember the whole deal where Diesel was wrecking shop at the Rumble and throwing people out of the ring left and right? 2 nights prior, and the people were cheering for him like God. Well, here he is on Raw a few days later as just a dude. He's still Shawn's bodyguard. Barely even got recognition for him cleaning shop in the Rumble. So much for that babyface run. But to be fair, this was a throwaway Raw anyway, so there really wasn't much of a reason to oversell his performance. Now, we still got a little bit of time before the split comes into full effect. But, I mean, not to sell this one short, but yeah, that was Raw. That was their big fallout from the 94 Royal Rumble pay-per-view. A moderately underwhelming show filled with the regular standard squashes, I guess. Most of which were no good. At least they hyped up next week's show a little bit as a bigger deal. We apparently have the showdown between the 1-2-3 Kid and Johnny Polo, as well as the sit-down between Luger and Brett, where they're going to hash things out and probably figure out what the game plan is headed into WrestleMania season. So there is at least that to look forward to. But yeah, sorry for the rather blasé recap. Just didn't even have a whole lot to say about this one now that I glanced over my notes again. I mean, normally I don't have anything to say about the SmackDown reports either, but I can at least go on 15-minute tangents about how horrible that show is. I can't even say the show was bad. It was just boring. Just a bunch of nothing happening squashes that didn't really accomplish anything. And while I'm sure you'd all love to hear me rant and rave about how horrible SmackDown probably was this past week, now you're going to have to sit tight and wait until we get done talking about next week's Royal Rumble. The current one, the 2023 one. Because after hearing about the return of the Firefly Fuckhouse, I don't think I'm really in the mood to subject myself to whatever horrors await me at the other end on Friday nights. Let's just get through the pitch black match and see if there's anything left of me by the end of it. God, I swear to God, if I see involvements from puppets or fiends or guys getting lit on fire, I might have an on-air conniption. I might pull a Ric Flair. I might do a Flair flop right in the middle of the podcast while I'm recording. I'm already fixing to bury that thing. Just don't give me an excuse to put the gun in my mouth at the same time, WWE. In the meantime, while everybody's setting up their shot game, good Lord. Is it possible to watch that match intoxicated and still wind up having it suck? I don't know. I get the sense that at least if I'm cognitively impaired, I mean, I could look past it in some aspects. Maybe I could have some fun with it. Or maybe not. Seriously, a Mountain Dew pitch black match. Well, at least we have the Friday show to look forward to. The Dynamite Report and the continuation of our other portion of the Retro Review Series. There won't be time for me to squeeze in a Rumble card preview beforehand, but don't worry about it. I promise, I'll spend a good chunk of the show next week going into detail about everything. And we'll treat next Monday's show kind of like this one, where we'll mainly focus on the Rumble event and the follow-up Retro Raw show. Hopefully with a little more to talk about on Raw, aside from a couple forgettable squashes. But, yeah. The Mountain Dew Pitch Black match. LA Knight versus Bray Wyatt. With Uncle Howdy hanging in the periphery, more than likely. I don't even know. I wish I could provide any initial commentary, but it'll be a spectacle. That is all that I can say about it for now. So, we'll see how horrible that ends up being next week. But until then, take care all. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. Again, share your thoughts. Let me know what you thought about the 1994 Royal Rumble, if you happen to have seen it or have any memories of it. And catch you on the flip side. Peace out.